afternoon. Pavel Zarubin, Russia TV channel. You and your colleagues have just completed the summit of the Eurasian Union. And our former partners recently ended the NATO summit. There was a decision to increase the cost of defense to 5% of GDP. In general, in Europe there are a lot of votes with calls for militarization. And such an aggressive position in Europe is generally something new in modern history. How do you evaluate what is happening? Firstly, the so-called Western community, the collective West, if you can call it a team today, but nevertheless, they rearrange everything upside down. Why? Because there is an increase in expenses for military purposes, and the militaristic carrier that you have now talked about. And all this is based on one thesis, on the aggressiveness of Russia. But in fact, everything is exactly the opposite. Indeed. Now the beginning for all these reasoning is 2022, the beginning of a special military operation. And how we all reach this special military operation? No one says a word about this. But how did it all start? It all started with the fact that they fooled us, rudely deceived, as we are popularly said. They simply inflated us about NATO expansion to the east. After all, the whole world is well known that Russia was promised that not a single inch east of NATO would advance, and then there were one wave of NATO expansion after another. After all, what did we talk about all the time? That the security of one country, or groups of countries, cannot be ensured at the expense of the safety of another, and so prescribed in international documents that were agreed by all. What happened in practice? There was one expansion after another, and they told us all the time, you should not be afraid of this. It does not threaten you. And when we replied that we think that it threatens us, that they answered us? Well, in general, nothing. They just sent us away with our opinion, and absolutely no one took it into account, and did not want to take it into account. But we better know what threatens us and what is not. This is our right to determine the degree of its safety and the level of threats that can approach us on one or the other side. But no one listened to us, and everyone moved in this direction. Is this not aggressive behavior? This is aggressive behavior that the West does not want to pay attention to. The same thing was in our country. When the collective West supported both separatism in our country and such an instrument of struggle with Russia as terrorism, no one wanted to pay attention to some ISIS if it is functioning in Russia, and explosions in Moscow, and anything from what has been happening recently, and no one wants to pay attention to it. It is good for them if it is against Russia. Well, haven't we seen this? And there they see all this perfectly and understand, but they talk about something else. They talk about our aggressiveness. Look at yourself. We have a good saying. They notice the sink in a strange eye, but in their eye they do not want to see a log. And what is happening? Against the background of this rhetoric about the allegedly imaginary aggressiveness of Russia, they begin to talk about the need to arm themselves. Well, let them arm themselves. Let's look at the structure of these expenses, at the structure of these weapons. I said the first part. We consider an absolutely unreasonable reference to Russia's aggressiveness. It is not we are aggressive, but this is the so-called collective West aggressive. By the way, the same thing happened in Ukraine. What is it? What to call? What happened as a result of the coup? Supported by the collective West? At first they arrived, signed guarantees between the president, the presidential authority, and the opposition. Then, a few days later, they conducted a coup. They supported it. They paid for it. They publicly confessed to this. And then they began to say that Russia behaves aggressively. What is this? Are they idiots themselves? Or do they take us for fools? Then, we all know what happened in the Donbass for 8 years. 8 years of bloody war, in fact, against the civilian population. And for 8 years we tried to agree in order to peacefully solve this issue. They deceived us. They again publicly admitted this. Both the former Chancellor of Germany and the former President of France publicly said that they were not going to comply with the Minsk agreements, and they signed all this only in order to pump up the Ukrainian regime. And they waged this undeclared war for 8 years. And in order to put an end to this war, we were forced to ultimately use the armed forces, recognizing the independence of both republics in strict accordance with the UN Charter. Nobody pays attention to this. Everything is only from this moment. Why? What happened? How did this happen? What is their fault? In general, as if they were babies, who were just born yesterday. This does not suit us. This game ended with one gate. They want to increase their military expenses. Well, let them increase. But this also speaks of their aggressiveness. Now I will explain why. Yes, we do not have small expenses today. This is 6.3% of GDP. Is it a lot or a little? I think this is a lot. Of course, this is one of the problems, including for the budget, that we must solve, and we solve it with dignity. By the way, I do not want to draw political analogies now, because the reasons for the conflict are completely different, but only from a financial and economic point of view. Say, during the war in Korea, which the United States waged, they spent 14% of their budget on this. And during the war in Vietnam, 10%. True. They solved these problems mainly due to an increase in taxation of persons with large incomes. Moreover, in the first case, they did not pay attention to macroeconomics. In the second case, they reacted more sensibly to this. But we are fighting for a healthy macroeconomics. Now about the expenses themselves. 6.3%. Is it a lot or a little? 6.3% of Russia's GDP for defense needs is 13.5 trillion rubles. And our entire GDP is 223 trillion rubles. 13.5 from 223, is this a lot or a little? This is a lot. We paid inflation for this. But we are now fighting with this inflation. Yes, we deliberately go to ensure that the economy has a soft landing. But, nevertheless, we are still very sensible to this. By the way, I already talked about this. The level of wages is increasing in all countries of the Eurasia Sea and Russia. Last year, it increased by 9.7%. And in the first 4 months or 5 months of the current year, the salary level increased by another 4% in real terms. By the way, this is at least a satisfactory indicator. What is happening in Western countries? They bury us all the time, but they themselves will die there soon, and they bury us constantly, without ceasing. We had an increase in the economy 4.3% last year. In the year before last, it was 4.1%. This year, the growth of our economy will be more modest in order to combat inflation. But we deliberately do this, and in Europe, growth is 0.9%. In leading economies, in industrial development centers in Europe, in Germany and France, they're generally balanced on the verge of recession. As for the armed forces, all the time they say that we have some problems, that soon they will achieve the strategic defeat of Russia. This rhetoric still does not stop. And at the same time, they broadcast that we are going to attack NATO countries. Where's the logic? If everything is falling apart, then why are we going to attack NATO? Well, they say nonsense. And they themselves certainly do not believe in it. But they try to convince their population of this in order to squeeze out more money out of people, so that they agree to bear the heavy burden of expenses in the social sphere. By the way, what do we spend these trillions to a large extent? We spend this money on maintaining our defense industrial complex, on ourselves, on our loved ones and our relatives. And what will they spend their 5% on? They will spend this money on purchases in the United States and to support their defense industrial complex. This is not our question. This is their business. If they want it, let them do. But now the most important thing. We plan to reduce defense costs. And next year, And in a year, and for the next 3 years we plan it. So far, there are no final agreements between the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Economic Development, but, in general, everyone thinks in this direction. And Europe thinks about how to raise its defense costs. Well, who is preparing for some aggressive actions? Are we or them? Yes. We want to complete a special military operation with the result we need, certainly. This is all calculated with us, precisely for this, and not on aggressive plans for Europe and NATO countries. And we plan to reduce expenses, and they plan to increase them. Well, who behaves aggressively? This is the basis of a policy in defense and security. Therefore, all their reasoning about the fact that they are going to increase military spending, well, let them increase them. But in the field of security, this situation will not improve the situation for them. And in the field of economics and in the social sphere, it will invariably worsen their situation. Interfax agency, Ksenia Cherneva. Vladimir Vladimirovich. Literally recently, the French president announced the need to introduce the next package of sanctions against Russia. And, judging by the statements of European officials, measures such as reducing the ceiling of Russian oil prices up to $45 per barrel and secondary sanctions for its buyers may include this package of sanctions. How do you feel about such measures? The rhetoric of the President of France? And what can be the consequences of such decisions? I already partially answered this question. The more sanctions, the worse for those who impose these sanctions. This also applies to France. This applies to the economy of Europe as a whole. After all, if you look at the statistics, the volume of gas purchased by them increased due to liquefied gas. Europe began to buy more. How much does gas cost today? More than 400 euros per 1,000 cubic meters? Now the price of oil has fallen a little. Well, not slightly, but from $75 to $65 or $66 per barrel. This price ranges all the time. But if anything else happens in the same Middle East, what will happen then? And if they still ban our oil? Although they will not be able to do this, it is simply impossible to date in fact. The volumes of oil and oil products consumed in the world are growing in connection with the growth of the economy itself. There is no getting away from this. Consumption volumes are growing. But oil production increases only in the volume that we agreed in the framework of OPEC+, and it is designed for increasing demand, especially in the summer. You understand that nothing here that would benefit the European economy. I see. Will there be any harm to us? Well, we will see based on those realities that will develop. But I do not think that this will significantly affect us, bearing in mind that hundreds, thousands of sanctions have already been introduced, and we are where we are, as I said. Last year, we have an economic growth amounted to 4.3%, and in Europe only 0.9 or 0.8%. Please, Andre. Good afternoon. Andrei Kolesnikov, the newspaper Kommersant. Vladimir Vladimirovich, do you have the feeling that it is time for you to personally meet with Donald Trump? From the side, it seems that you somehow move away from each other. Well, the phone is a phone, and communication with the eye on the eye is different. What do you think? I belong to the current President of the United States with great respect. He passed a very difficult, complex and unsafe path of returning to power and to the White House. We all know this well, up to the point that he survived the attempt on his life, and not one attempt. He is a courageous person. This is clear. What he does inside the country is what he does in the field of the situation in the Middle East. and his efforts to resolve the Ukrainian crisis. Of course, we are very appreciated. I have already talked about this. I want to say it publicly now. I believe that President Trump is sincerely striving to resolve the issue on the Ukrainian track. Recently, in my opinion, he stated that it turned out to be more complicated than it seemed from the outside. Well, it's true. And here, too, there is nothing special. It is one thing when you look from the outside, and another thing is when you plunge into the problem, just as I think it happens in the Middle East. Although, maybe he had a lot of experience there. He was more involved in events in the Middle East. But everything is also complicated there. Real life is always more complicated than it seems. I am always open to contacts, to meetings. I know that Mr. Trump also talked about the possibility of a meeting. Well, I, just like him, believe that such meetings need to be prepared. And according to the results of preparation, we must go to some new borders of cooperation. In general, thanks to President Trump, relations between Russia and the United States are beginning to align in at least something. Not everything was decided in the field of diplomatic relations, but, nevertheless, the first steps are taken, and we are moving on. Our work contact has been established between the main departments and between the State Department, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, between special services, which is also very important, because, say, such an aspect as the fight against terrorism, it is important for us in any situation. And along the line of some other services, we have very good prospects in the field of economic interaction. And we know that American business shows a desire and sends us signals that they would like to return to our market. We will only welcome it. All this needs to be prepared sequentially. And so, in general, this meeting is quite possible, and we will be happy to prepare it. Thanks a lot. Good luck.